Welcome everyone, Costin here with a discussion about Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. One of the things that's been brought to my attention, courtesy of the Great Book of Grudges and his video on the subject, is that Creative Assembly actually has a list of known issues in the game. This is a great thing to have because it gives you an idea of what Creative Assembly considers to be an issue and what they don't. There are many things on this list that are actual issues, though they might have gotten certain things wrong, and there are some things that are missing. One of the most critical ones I would say is actually missing is the Imperial Dilemma issue. Let me explain. Since patch 2.2, Imperial Dilemmas for Karl Franz and Balthazar Gelt don't seem to work properly. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because it ties into your Imperial Authority. More crucially, it ties into your Confederation, because Confederation for Karl Franz and Balthazar Gelt are tied to the Dilemma event popping off once you've got 10 fealty with a faction. If the Dilemma event doesn't work, you can't confederate. It's something I've noticed in the campaigns I've tried playing as them. It basically means that they're broken. It doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen. And I don't see that on this list, and it absolutely should. Now, some things that they do have on this list beyond just, bugs like Pestilence Scheme, Draco not being able to recruit Quodil, etc., beyond those kind of obvious issues and things that don't really deserve a comment because, yeah, they're bugs, they should be resolved. Some things I do want to highlight. Ranged units don't shoot targets that are in line of sight. This is a major problem that I've talked about in other videos. I'm going to link one of those videos at the end of this one, and I recommend you check it out because it gets ridiculous. It gets to the point that a ranged army is just flat out weaker than a pure melee army in a lot of cases. If you've got, especially from a faction that has melee benefits, warriors of chaos, vampire counts, etc., because ranged units just don't work properly. And this applies not just to line of sight or a direct line of fire on an open field. It applies in sieges, choke points, etc., and it's because of some changes that were made earlier this year. Creative Assembly, I guess, tried to fix this issue, then they botched it, then they reversed that and made it worse. It actually was. Gunpowder units feel very broken right now, especially in minor settlement siege battles. They won't shoot a lot of the time, they won't be effective, but it's not just that. It's archer units, it's crossbow units, they've got a lot of problems. It's artillery units as well. Speaking about artillery units, the AI can preempt and dodge artillery strikes. Oh yes, that is a major frustration. It feels like when it comes to artillery strikes that they're using the SIG system designed to dodge spells, which in itself feels a bit ridiculous, because yes, sometimes you will dodge spells and the AI dodging them seems fine. The problem is, however, that the AI doing this constantly just beggars belief, because no human player or anyone controlling the game, even if it was an AI controlling the game in the sense like an AI having, mouse and keyboard access to it, not through in-game scripting, would never react like this. It would just be too much, unless they had crazy levels of APM. But even then, I think they'd be hard-pressed to dodge all the mortar shells that are being thrown that way. It also causes an issue in the battles themselves, because the AI may just be running around like a brainless chicken, trying to avoid strikes and putting itself in really bad positions. That's another factor as well, because, yes, it can be cheesed. I think we've seen, anyone who's played Immortal Empires to a decent degree has seen the AI just completely breaking on the battlefield, clumping up, and getting torn to shreds in the process. Or, for instance, you're fighting a ranged duel against the AI, and you're just sitting there shooting, and they're running around back and forth, and I think that kind of behavior is contributing the AI's behavior when it comes to artillery strikes. The AI should try and dodge, like as a player, you will try and dodge artillery strikes because you're oncoming there, and there is a way to do it. But the fact that they're doing instantly and they're always doing it does also create a lot of problems for him. And it's also frustrating as well in a lot of situations for the players, because it makes mortars and other artillery pieces less useful. Though it's also something you can exploit. But yeah, those are some obvious issues. Also, ranged units running into melee after running out of ammo with guard mode on. Yep, notice that one. Now, some issues that I fundamentally disagree with Creative Assembly, and I think some things that I do want to talk about in more detail. First one, auto-resolve values seem overly favorable towards the player in Immortal Empires. I'm going to call plain bullshit on that. If anything, the auto-resolve is extremely punishing towards the player. However, there are certainly scenarios in which, as a player, you can take advantage of the auto-resolve situation. And then, too many settlement battles. Are there too many settlement battles? Yes, there are. Though not necessarily because of, like, oh, how the AI is moving on the campaign or anything like that. I think it comes down to also the auto-resolve, because too many casualties in auto-resolve means you're going to want to fight a bunch of pointless minor settlement battles. So it contributes to the issue. It's intrinsically tied, I think, to the issue, not just, oh, what are the issues in sieges? No, it's what are the issues with the auto-resolve causing players to fight a bunch of pointless minor settlement battles and siege battles that they just win easily, even on the highest difficulty, if they do it manually. But let's talk about that auto-resolve issue first and foremost. So let's talk about the auto-resolve. I have a campaign turn 1 just started as Vlad von Karstein. The campaign difficulty is easy, the battle difficulty is easy as well. Auto-resolve is governed by battle difficulty. The lower it is, the better your odds are going to be in terms of auto-resolve. As well, benefits that you get if you fight the battle manually. But anyway, you start with Vlad, you start with 2 heroes, you start with Graveguard, Blood Knights, Vargeist, Felbats, and a Black Coach. And we do have an army over here of 2 Graveguard, 3 zombies, and some dire wolves. A fairly weak army, actually. But let's say I take this on the lowest possible difficulty, and I just simply auto-resolve it. What's the outcome going to be? And this is a strong army. Vlad has a lot of power behind him. Well, I lose 80 men. The number can vary, by the way. You can lose 100 men, you can lose more. And if you set the difficulty higher, you will lose more. But that's almost a fifth of my entire army potential. And this is a good situation. Some other lords will have it much, much worse. Vlad won't, and he does have a lot of tools available to him. The vampire counts are certainly one of the stronger races available in the game right now. Like, one of the things I could have done before the battle is exactly that. But still, out of 500 men to lose 80, that is not exactly a great outcome. Even if it might seem like it, because when you do fight the battle manually, things are going to be much, much different. And I'll just show that. Now, on the second take, turn 1 again, but this time around, the campaign difficulty and battle difficulty are set to the highest possible level. If I auto-resolve it here, I would lose, according to the game, I would have medium casualties. It would probably be half my army, if not more, or less. But in the actual battle itself, I will very, very easily curb stomp this entire army with minimal casualties. And it's not like I'm going to use fancy tactics or anything to do it. Vlad's entire army, by the way, has Vanguard deployment. So that's absolutely something that I'm going to take advantage of. By either way, let's just take everything he has, put them in a control group, start deployment, and just simply attack. Nothing too fancy, really. The dire wolves are there. I'm just going to send my knights over there, flying units to flank around, and we advance. One thing to also keep in mind, by the way, where is that lord? There we go. One thing to keep in mind, by the way, is that you've got magical abilities. Just gonna slow them down so I can actually use that. Isabella is going to take a bit of damage there. But it won't really matter. The dire wolves have already been completely, utterly broken. The zombies over here are crumbling. The Graveguard will put up a decent enough fight. But it is soon going to be over very, very quickly. The only one who's actually going to survive a decent amount of time is the Lord, and the unit that's actually going to take the most damage are these bats, if I allow them to. Let's get more healing. One of the critical elements of playing vampires is that, yeah, you've got a lot of battle healing. Helmet Gorst actually has the most of it. And that doesn't seem to count at all when we're talking about the situation you would face in an auto-resolve. By the way, most of the enemy army has certainly crumbled over here. Isabella's going to take a bit of damage, but it's not really going to be any real issue. Those Grave Guard are certainly taking damage there, and the battle is won. So on the highest possible difficulty of the game, I only lost 25 men. Now, of course, how many men you lose is not all that matters. The damage that Vlad and Isabella took was higher, but just bear in mind that we were comparing the lowest possible difficulty in auto-resolve versus the highest possible battle difficulty in a manual battle. If you were to auto-resolve this on Legendary, the damage to the army would be far more extreme, as opposed to just fighting it manually and doing some simple healing spells, as well as a couple of flank attacks, and I can certainly recover very easily from any damage that they took. By the way, lords and heroes do regenerate very, very quickly. Here's some of the things that the auto-resolve is basing its results on. One, it's basing it on difficulty, so on a higher difficulty, such as Legendary, very hard or on very hard battle difficulty, you're going to take more casualties by default. Some other things that the auto-resolve is basing it on is numbers. So if I want an easier time, just get more troops. Even if the zombies and skeletal warriors and skeletal spearmen won't really do a lot, just the fact that I do have more troops will help me with the auto-resolve outcome. And of course, there is obviously more when you start considering various aspects of it all. So there are a lot of issues with auto-resolve. It cares a great deal, from my experience, playing Warhammer free in particular. Here's what the auto-resolve cares about, here's what the auto-resolve flat out ignores. One of the things it really cares about is armor. So these units, these Grave Guard, will take, in general, take significantly less damage than lower armored units like zombies, which have 0 armor, or skeletal warriors, or Velbats. Though infantry units will generally take more damage than flying units. So it cares a lot about armor. It also cares about leadership. So units with high leadership, like Blood Knights, Graveguard, which have decent leadership, Lords, all that, they will take fewer damage. They'll take less damage, and they'll count more for the outcome in auto-resolve. But some things the auto-resolve doesn't care at all about. A couple of things, just to name a few, because there's a lot of things that the auto-resolve represents very, very poorly. The first one is actually ranged units. Oh yes. This is a major problem for certain races, because for instance, Kislev, their roster is predominantly ranged units. Like armor Kossars are still ranged units. Regular Kossars are pure ranged units pretty much. In an actual battle between Kislev and another faction, Kislev will do significant damage to, say, Norskins, Skaven, etc. long before those guys enter the melee fray. But in auto-resolve, that kind of distinction doesn't really matter. Although melee units take more damage, the actual sheer power in a proper battle is now represented for ranged units. Another thing that the auto-resolve doesn't care at all is, or it feels like it doesn't care at all about it, and it applies to both the player and the AI, is fear and terror. Two different effects. Basically, Vlad isn't very strong because he's got this instant recruitment, or he's got a very cheap army. No, the reason Vlad is so strong is because it's not because of the damage his units can get. It's because he can route an entire army long before his own army has taken damage or done any significant damage. This won't necessarily apply if fighting other vampire counts, because they have their own fear and terror, of course, available. But it is a significant omission to not really count for that. Like, if you can auto-resolve Vlad, for instance, like if you're fighting Vlad or the vampire counts in general, you're actually much better off auto-resolving it than fighting a battle. Same, by the way, with Kislev. If you can auto-resolve your way to victory, and you can, it's actually better to do so than it is to fight him manually. This, by the way, doesn't just apply to the player, it applies to the AI. The way it's handled has a significant impact on how things play out for the AI. Kislev tends to get wiped out very easily in a lot of campaigns because they have a poor auto-resolve. Skaven have a poor auto-resolve, though they bring so many numbers that they kind of make up for it. But even the Skaven power is not necessarily properly represented in a battlefield, because Skaven might have a lot of skirmisher units that can do a lot of damage while taking very, very little in return. For instance, a really good example I can give of this is if I head all the way east, Snitch, for instance, you might not realize it looking at his starting position, and you might not realize it in just for the auto-resolve, but Snitch can wipe out these greenskins with just his starting army. I'm not joking on this. He doesn't need to recruit anything else, though you might want to do so all the same. But you can wipe out all of them on the highest difficulty with just his starting army. Because his starting army has some skirmisher units and has some range, has a decent amount of range power that the Savage Orcs just don't have a counter for. The Savage Orcs having absolutely no armor, really. Skaven have poor armor, but they'll absolutely tear to shreds those Savage Orcs in a battle. And it is a major problem. It also applies to the High Elves because, yeah, they've got a lot of ranged units. But this goes much further than just simple open field battles. It also applies to sieges. For instance, when it comes to sieges, and this is really where things get hilarious, if you attack a High Elven or Dark Elven settlement at tier 3, and you're not cheesing the towers in some way, shape, or form, or if you just straight up attack, right, while ignoring the damage the towers will do, or the AI attacks you, the towers can wipe out your entire army, because they're very, very strong. Dark Elven towers, High Elven towers, they can absolutely rip an army to shreds if you're not careful about that. But that's, again, not reflected. There is a benefit to the defender, but the thing about the auto-resolve, it's not at all reflecting the actual power individual armies have. As I said, it cares about numbers, armor, leadership. Those are the three main things it cares about. Unit ranks, lord ranks, power of lords, all that. Yes, the auto-resolve will represent that. Number of heroes, all that. The auto-resolve loves heroes. Those will be reflected, but the actual way the battles are fought and the way these armies play out is not at all, like the auto-resolve does not at all match the reality on the battlefield, with some exceptions. There are some exceptions, like Treekin are great in auto-resolve because they have high armor, and they'll absolutely tear an army to shreds because they have high armor, do good damage, and cause fear. So an army will rout facing them. The Treekin of the Talariel and the Wood Elves can recruit. Like Legend of Total War was doing a series of live streams playing as Orion, and looking at that, looking at the one he did yesterday, he was just basically recruiting pure Treekin armies, just throwing them at the enemy, and he was doing great in both battles and auto-resolve. But the crucial point here is there's not an advantage that the player has in an auto-resolve. If anything, we take significant damage in the vast majority of auto-resolve situations, unless we have those kind of specific armies. But even then, compared to how these things play out in battles, even then, the actual outcome does not match reality, as I've shown there with Vlad, for instance, because he will take almost 4 times as many casualties, over 3 times as many casualties, between a battle auto-resolved on easy and the same battle fought manually on legendary, very hard battle difficulty. So the idea that auto-resolve is somehow favoring the players, I'm like saying, no, that's pure bullshit. Now, of course, if you're an intelligent player, you've got experience with the game, there are things you can take advantage of when it comes to dot resolve. You could recruit a pure army that does have good advantages in auto resolve, like avoid zombies, get Graveguard. If you're playing as Kislev, get Armored Cossars, because they'll do better than regular Cossars in auto resolve, not necessarily in battles. If you're playing Kislev, play Boris Ursus, because he has an army that does well in auto resolve, because he has heavily armored, high leadership units, Warbears, Tsarguard, Armored Cossars. I mean, it is ridiculous how easy Boris's campaign is compared to Catherine's or Castalton. Not necessarily because he's got a better starting position or he's that much stronger in an actual proper battle, but because he can auto-resolve a lot of his early game battles and then replenish from it. Another factor that I do want to highlight here is not only if you're a player will you take significantly more damage in the vast majority of battles than you would if you fight them manually. Some exceptions, like if the AI has a lot of walls, that if the AI is cowering behind their walls, you could take more damage fighting the battle. Some exceptions, or if you're fighting an army like Drykas. When I'm dealing with Dryka in any campaign, be it Azek, Vlad, or Kislev, if I'm dealing with her, I never, ever want to fight her army, her main army, manually. Or even her settlement. I never want to do that for a combination of things. I never want to do that because even though she has a strong army in auto-resolve, she actually has a much stronger army on the field. But again, this is not because of anything. There's no favoritism to the player. As I've mentioned again and again, you take significantly more damage. But the reason you want to auto-resolve against Rika is her fear effects, her leadership debuffs will cause your entire army to rout very easily, and you will just lose against her. And on top of that, also she does have some ranged units which can do a significant amount of damage if you fight them in a proper battle. In fact, in pretty much any campaign that's close to Dryka, the way I've dealt with her is I've brought 2 stacks, 3 stacks against her, caught her out of position, and auto-resolved. I avoid fighting Wood Elven armies if I can, because they're really strong in an open field, unless I have like a significant terrain advantage or range superiority. Claw has that. And it's actually better with some factions to fight battles manually, as opposed to auto-resolving. Claw is actually a great example of a lord, or a race really, with the Skaven, where the actual power you have in auto-resolve is significantly lower than the power you have on a battlefield. Because auto-resolve, it feels like with Claw, doesn't account for, the fact that he has nuclear weapons, or the sheer ranged insanity that he can bring to the table with his Rowling Gunners and Giselles. Now, terrain can be a major factor, but even with terrain, the fact this guy has a nuke, it's like that nuke can wipe out your entire army. But again, that's not reflected in auto-resolve. If I ever fight Claw, I prefer to auto-resolve against them than it is to fight against them. And this is just because of the way the system works. So what do I think should be changed on that? Well, a couple of things I feel should be changed on that. Fundamentally, I think the entire system should be changed in a lot of ways. Ranged armies should be... the ranged firepower of an army should be counted for better, I feel, in an auto-resolve. Like if you're playing with Claw, like consider this, if you're playing with Claw, you're never gonna charge your ranged units to get slaughtered en masse. You're gonna choose all the advantages of a battlefield to suit those ranged units, Rowling Gunners and Giselles, doing a lot of damage. Despite all the issues that ranged units do have right now, you can still get a lot more from Claw by fighting manually as opposed to auto-resolving. So I do feel like the actual power of armies, not just range power, like power of fear effects, terror effects, leadership effects, should be accounted for in a proper battle. Like if I'm massing my Cossars as Kislev, for instance, if I bring an entire stack of Cossars and it's like a choke point or something like that, like the bridge over here, then a mass of Cossars can hold back a larger force if you're using them properly. Of course, tactics can't be accounted for, but I find more often than not, even the most stupid, simplistic tactics and battles yield far better results for me as the player than it is to auto-resolve. Therein lies the problem, because it creates a lot of battles that just feel meaningless, pointless, and a waste of time for me as a player that I'm having to fight manually. In fact, I've had a great deal of fun in Total War as of late by just literally playing a lot of campaigns as this. Simple as that, just setting the battle difficulty to easy. But even then, I still take more damage, and more crucially, I actually gain less experience on easy, it feels like. Or I gain less experience if I'm relying on the auto-resolve. So what do I think should be changed with the auto-resolve? Beyond accounting for proper power. Yes. Well, I think the auto-resolve should cause significantly less casualties, because right now, the auto-resolve just causes an enormous amount of casualties that would not happen to either you or the AI in an actual battle that you fight manually. Now, the way, but instead of doing that, what Creative Assembly does for the AI on higher difficulties is they give them a ridiculous amount of replenishment. And for the player, it's the same thing. The strongest factions in the game, do you know what they have in common? The Greenskins, the Vampire Counts, the Warriors of Chaos. Not only do they have heavily armored units, potentially, or they can bring a lot of units, or both. Not only do they have that going for them, but on top of that, they have amazing replenishment. Because, hey, if you have amazing replenishment, guess what? You can steamroll the campaign without having to stop. And I think that's possibly one of the things that should be changed. If you have poor replenishment, the Dwarves, Cafe actually, then you may need to stop quite a lot more often. And as a result of that, if you're stopping to replenish, then you're losing the initiative. So I think what should happen, instead of Creative Assembly thinking about the auto-resolve as favoring the player, it doesn't. You take a lot more damage in auto-resolve. I think they should consider the fact that we should move away from the pretty much near instantaneous replenishment that currently happens with AI on many difficulties, not just legendary. Should move away from that kind of thinking, and should move away from an auto-resolve system that delivers ridiculous damage and actually gives you less experience in post-battle loot than if you fight the battle. Because this actually ties in neatly to the other issue that I mentioned, the settlement issue, too many settlement battles. Well, here's the problem. If the auto-resolve, because with the settlement issues, and I probably will make another video of that. On that, I've talked about the settlement issue, the minor settlement battles, the siege battles, the mechanics, the issues of battle mechanics, etc. But fundamentally, I think the problem, I think a lot of people are viewing this issue incorrectly. I think a lot of people are considering the issue of settlement battles, and they're thinking, oh, how are the towers, how are the barricades, how is the AI behaving, etc., pathfinding, etc. All of those are legitimate issues, but fundamentally, I think, the reason people don't enjoy settlement battles, the reason people don't enjoy dealing with garrisons is because it's boring as dirt. It's because you know you have a lot of power on your hands. Like, look at Vlad's army over here, right? Vampire Counts have a great deal of power. His army can take Tempelhof. It's not even a fucking contest, right? But I have to. His army can easily sweep everything around him. But I have to do that manually, because if I do it, in the auto-resolve, guess what will happen? I'll take significantly more casualties, and I might need to stop. So instead, I'm gonna have to fight a bunch of boring ass battles manually that offer no challenge, no entertainment, nothing to them, that are just plain boring, and the only reason I'm fighting them is because I take fewer casualties with dumb, simplistic tactics. That's what needs to change from my perspective. The auto-resolve needs to be less punishing, not more punishing. And when I say less punishing, I'm not talking about the odds over there, like between defeat and decisive victory, though I feel that those are heavily skewed against the player in favor of the AI already. But I'm also talking about how many casualties you're getting. For instance, if you're going to get the decisive victory, I don't think I fought any single actual battle manually, where unless I was doing some really, really stupid stuff, where I could lose half my army. But when you auto-resolve it, more often than not, when you're doing it in an auto-resolve, more often than not, you actually do end up losing either a third, a quarter, or half your army to just the auto-resolve. Even if in the actual battle, you would steamroll the enemy and lose barely any men. And that's just a plainly bad system, as far as I'm concerned with it. And that's what adds to this issue of too many Salomon battles, because we end up having to fight a lot of garrisons. Do you know who this is the worst for, or one of the worst lords for? It's actually Scarbrand. Like, look at Scarbrand. He's got Bloodletters, he's got Chaos Warriors, he's gonna tear these Savage Orcs to shreds. And he does, if you fight these battles manually. But one of the biggest problems I have with this campaign, beyond the mechanics of the campaign, is if you're playing Scarbrand, you pretty much have to fight the vast majority of battles manually, partly because, not just because of the casualties you're taking, but also the blood hosts he summons can't replenish, so they can't recover from the damage they're taking. I think we need to move away from the casualty replenishment system to just less damage done if you're gonna win the battle. Because like Scarbrand himself, he can take entire settlements on his own. We know he can. We've seen this guy in action. And he's probably one of the best examples of this, because he can absolutely tear his enemies apart. But if you try and auto-resolve his campaign, ooh, it's gonna end really badly. But you then have to fight a bunch of pointless, meaningless battles. Because look at his campaign situation, right? He starts over here, he only has that army to deal with, and then he has an army at the end there in Stormridge. If you even go there. But until you get there, maybe this army moves to Gorgazan, but you're not really going to face any significant opposition. And yet, I do have to fight all of these battles myself, manually, if I'm going to achieve any kind of level of success. And they're just pointless, boring, dull, forgettable, and honestly dreadful. That's how I feel with regards to this situation. So far from the auto-resolve situation being biased against the players, and far from the situation with sieges being the way they work or anything like that. There are problems, don't get me wrong, there's problems, a lot of issues. I think the problem with too many settlement battles is intrinsically tied to the casualties you're taking with auto-resolve. Maybe something else to consider when it comes to settlement battles. One of the things would be when you're attacking a settlement and you have overwhelming force, maybe you take no casualties if you auto-resolve it, minimal casualties, because you would in an actual battle. But more importantly, maybe you should have a demand surrender button. We've had that in previous Total War games, and although it wasn't great, maybe we should have that. Maybe there should be some factional limitations, because yeah, how likely are people going to surrender to Scarbrand, right? But it might be an option, like just taking a settlement at the tier it is instead of downgrading its tier by auto-resolving, because whenever you take a settlement, its level gets degraded by 1. Maybe that could be a benefit, and maybe some public order benefit. I mean, and this is actually something, you know, we've had in previous Total War games, as well as auto-resolve doing significantly less casualties when attacking a settlement. Because right now, settlements, one of the problems with settlements, and one of the problems that existed, if you attack any settlement in the game, the defender always gets a major advantage. Just because they're the defender in a settlement. It doesn't matter if the settlement, if you're just fighting an open field battle, but because it's counted as a settlement, that can be to your advantage. Maybe that kind of benefit should be removed completely for minor settlements, because at least until you get the garrison building, and maybe then you can add it back in. But that's where I do stand on that particular issue. And you know what? Talking about casualties that you do take for auto-resolve, I just reinstalled Shogun 2 on my computer recently, and you actually do have auto-resolve situations against settlements where you auto-resolve and you take 0 casualties, 0 damage to your army. I'm not asking for anything that didn't exist before, because we've had a demand surrender button, lower casualties in auto-resolve. I mean, it says a lot when I'm saying the auto-resolve in Shogun 2 is somehow favorable to the auto-resolve in Warhammer 3, because that auto-resolve system had a lot of issues going for it. But yeah, Shogun 2 actually felt a lot better when it comes to that. Still feels a lot better when it comes to that. and I just think that there's design flaws, and heavy design flaus. Like, don't get me wrong, the auto resolve we currently have in Warhammer 3 is probably one of the best we've had in the series, but it just punishes you for using it. It either punishes you it punishes you in the sense that you're fighting a lot of pointless settlement battles, or a lot of pointless battles in general, and it punishes you because you're getting too little in terms of post-battle loot, experience, you name it. Because you will gain more generally when you're fighting those manually. Especially on a high difficulty level. Do you know why on a high difficulty level? Because, yes, the AI gets benefits on a higher difficulty levels. But one of those benefits, if I'm not mistaken, is a leadership benefit. So armies will actually stay and fight quite a lot, which means more casualties, all that, more troops potentially captured as well, more post-battle loot options. That's why I think, anyway, about Creative Assembly's list. Costin here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and I'll see you next time.